Patrick, welcome. We're really pleased to have Patrick here. He's runs the really successful website and kind of policy hub and newsletter called Metaverse EU. He's also leading the tech practice at Foretold, which is a public affairs consultancy, and is involved with the World Economic Forum's working group on metaverse governance. And just recently, Patrick, you also did an interview with Neil for your newsletter as well, which I think went down very well. So
Yes, I had a lovely chat with Neil, and that'll be out tomorrow for everyone's reference.
excellent, out tomorrow, brilliant. So Patrick, over to you. 15-20 minutes presentation, 10 minutes discussion. That would be really great.
Okay, fantastic. Well, firstly, thank you very much, Kat and Chad, for having me, and obviously to the rest of the working group. I'm going to go through this deck. It's going to be very, focused on EU policy, and it's going to be very policy heavy. I've got the chat box open, so if there are any questions or if I'm using any annoying lingo, then please ask throughout. Let me see. Let's go through. So first, I'm just going to give a bit of an overview about what we're going to try and cover today. I'm going to introduce Metaverse EU. That's the organization that Chad was just speaking about. Then we're going to dive into how the EU is approaching this topic. There's kind of two big strands I want to cover. Firstly, how is the European Commission, so the EU's executive arm, looking at the metaverse? And then there's a couple of initiatives from the Parliament, so the elected house. Then we're going to have a very brief overview of what we might expect in 2024. We had a very busy year in 2023, so we're kind of expecting that momentum to continue over. And then finally, yes, I think as I've said, we're going to leave some time for some questions. So let me dive into a bit more about what Metaverse EU does once I can. Okay. So Metaverse EU. So why did we set this up? At the time, it was about a year and a half ago, and I was working for a think tank just basically focused solely on AI. My background before that was in trust and safety and content moderation. This is Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission. And in September 2022, the EU announced an initiative on virtual worlds such as the Metaverse. This came as a bit of a surprise. It would certainly come as a surprise, I think, to most European citizens that the government was doing so much on this topic. It was also interesting to me that there wasn't really much conversation going on from a sort of policy perspective. What are the emerging issues? What are the debates? What are the trade-offs? This conversation wasn't really happening. So I thought Metaverse EU would be a useful way to fill that gap, to try and foster knowledge about what I think will be some incoming regulation. What do? We're a policy hub, so we do analysis of regulation and these initial initiatives I'm going to speak about today. We also do explainers about concepts in the metaverse, which I think everyone in this group will be familiar with how murky waters that can be. We cover some business news across the EU. It's kind of pleasantly surprising how much is going on. Then we also do events. We have massive events calendars. We help support events, and we do partnerships around the EU. And yeah, of course, please check us out, and you'll see tomorrow that Neil Trevitz will be featured on our site, which we're very excited about. So before we dive into what's going on in the EU, I just want to give a sort of broad brush, because we did this piece of work in the summer with another consultancy called Consulum, and we tried to map out all of the various initiatives that we saw going on around the world on this topic. It could be anything from Barbados having a public embassy in the virtual space, to sort of what you see in Japan and South Korea with them creating economic metaverse zones and trying to encourage innovation and startup culture. Or it can be something more advanced, like you see the Dubai's metaverse strategy and the Finnish metaverse strategy. So that we found that there's a hell of a lot going on. That said, I still think nobody really had a busier year than the EU. So let's have a look at what happened in the last 12 months. In February to April, the EU held a citizens panel on virtual worlds. For those who aren't familiar, citizens panels are kind of like big focus groups. So what the EU did, which was quite incredible and impressive, they got together 150 citizens from all over the bloc. So from 27 countries, I think there are 23 languages. There were interpreters in the room, so everybody could speak their native tongue. They then had experts come in and inform the citizens about this topic as best they could. And after 3 weekends of deliberation, they came up with 23 recommendations for the EU to act on this topic. And Chad was also invited to the citizens panel. That's great. Yeah, we also represented ourselves as Metaverse EU there, and it was a really fun occasion. There was something quite inspiring about seeing all the different, everybody from age, different social backgrounds, different cultures. It was quite incredible. So then we had an open consultation on virtual worlds and Web 4.0. I'm going to ignore the terminology for a moment, if you don't mind. We saw over 170 companies feed into this consultation. All the big names, the sort of European brands like Lego, Siemens, Dassault Systems, but then also the giants like Meta and Microsoft. It was a really busy period. We sort of again a kind of surprising amount of interest from the private sector. Then in July, this was kind of the big milestone. In July, the EU published a block-wide strategy on virtual worlds and Web 4.0. But it didn't stop there. Sort of then we had the European Parliament submit reports. We had one in November and then one again in December from the Legal Affairs Committee. These reports actually passed today, so kind of good timing. And we're going to dive into all of these little initiatives as we go through. I'm going to start though with the EU strategy on virtual worlds and Web 4.0. So what is the EU strategy? It's what we call a communication in the EU. So it's not kind of a piece of it's not a robust piece of regulation, which you might have heard about the AI Act that's been going on in the last year or so. No, it's really just an initial analysis of this topic. So they provide their initial position. They're talking about the great benefit of these technologies. There's not a lot of sort of granular policy language in this document. So you could call it vague, not super useful. And it kind of begs the question. I mean, why should we, before we even look at the details of this, why should we care about a document like this? Well, on the one hand, we shouldn't. Again, it's not legislative. If you're a company, you're probably thinking, well, why is this interesting to us? It doesn't even it doesn't even think about the risk of regulation in the future. So what's the importance of a communication like this? Well, firstly, it gets the conversation going. It got the ball rolling in Brussels. There were many stakeholders that started responding to this, and whether the response was critical or supportive, it created a conversation. But the main reason that companies should care is if you look back to the regulatory journey of something like the AI Act. What actually happened there was an initial communication, very much like this, sort of not very concrete, quite vague, calling for more research, calling for more funding. We then had another one a year later, another one half a year later, and then a year after that, we had the AI Act that was proposed. So I see this really as the sort of agenda setting phase, and it's going to seem very early, but I think it's kind of consequential. I think I just lagged a little bit. Are we still sharing? Yeah. Okay, before we go into the details of what this document actually says, I want to sort of take a moment to talk about Web 4.0. Yeah, this was kind of a huge surprise. We saw when the initiative was announced in 2022, we had the commissioner that was running this talking about metaverses and virtual worlds, and already this was kind of creating a bit of a linguistic stir. But then when it was announced in summer that it would be an initiative on Web 4.0, it sort of led to a bit of head scratching. Let's have a look at what it means to the Commission. So Web 4.0, it's this fourth generation of the World Wide Web. One of the key technologies is virtual worlds, and kind of the key feature is that digital and real objects, I think we would call that physical objects, are fully integrated and are communicating with one another. Virtual worlds are persistent immersive environments. They've tried to sort of sandwich in extended reality here. I think that would diverge from how most of us on this call would understand virtual worlds. But again, the sort of the semantic goal here is the making physical and digital worlds blend in real time. Looking at the working documents that came with this strategy, I've just sort of put together a table of how this is how the EU are understanding these topics. So, Web 1, the 1990s, static web pages. Web 2, these sort of user-generated content, social media age. Web 3, decentralized tokenized economies. And now this is kind of where things get tricky, because I think most people would not think that we have bypassed a Web 3 era. I think even the most staunch Web 3 enthusiasts would read this document with utter confusion. But anyway, here we are entering this Web 4 era. And again, I'm not kidding you. They really have referenced this Web3 concept as having taken place in 2010s. Why is this important? Well, it's a bit unhelpful. Forums like this come together to try and make companies and organizations and governments communicate with each other in a frictionless way. So when you start introducing nebulous concepts like this, it's a little bit unproductive. It also defies some of the research that's gone into the word metaverse. It's not just a term that's been pushed by one company. There's papers by the IEEE on I think 260 definitions of this, and you won't find something comparable for Web 4. And finally, you'll see in the document a lot of references to the economic potential of virtual worlds, and really all of these studies are referencing the metaverse, which might be a different concept, and it actually is a different concept according to the commission. So it was pretty disappointing to see this wording, especially from a kind of interoperability point of view. And I'll leave it to your imaginations to guess why they didn't want to call it the metaverse. My guess is the first four letters. Anyway, okay, let's get back to the document. So yeah, this is just a bit of the reaction. Sorry, before we move on to the word. I mean, it was sort of universal confusion. Okay, let's get back to the strategy then. So the strategy was structured around 10 key actions. They fell into 3 different buckets. We had skills, business, and governance. All of these actions are promised to take place between now and September. So we're still looking for many of this to surface. So on skills, what do the EU want to do? They want to not just develop skills within the bloc, but also become an attractive destination for foreign talent. They also want to support research and academic research into the impact of virtual worlds. One of the key ones here is they're going to publish, and also very imminent, this is meant to happen in the next couple of months, to publish a virtual worlds toolbox. If you're wondering what a toolbox is, it's kind of like a public small briefing document that's intended for the public that outlines the EU's intentions and actions around a certain issue. And also they want to provide resources here for young people. In terms of business, they want to launch what they're calling a new European partnership. This is really just connecting the dots on the ecosystem at the moment. They want to support collaboration, and most interesting for this group, there is a lot of talk in the document about supporting the development of standards. Governance, they want to support public flagships, create smart cities. There's already lots of partnerships happening with local city mayors at the moment in the EU. They want to set up a member states expert group and support the creation of a technical stakeholder forum. And finally, this is going to sound quite vague, but actually for EU people, it's quite interesting. They want to create a way of constantly monitoring virtual worlds, because it is a nascent topic. So we're not seeing people walking around with headsets all the time. But I think the EU is also conscious and maybe a bit nervous of the fact that this could become a consumer product at a speed that will go ahead of regulation. So I think they want to create a system to monitor it too. Finally, there is this other bucket that's kind of just referred to at the very end of the document, which is infrastructure. They want to make sure that the EU is actually ready to run some of these new products and services. So this isn't addressed in the EU strategy, but there's a lot of work going on at the moment in the EU to make sure that we have, the network capacity. We have an EU-wide goal to make every 100% of households by 2030 have a gigabyte speed infrastructure. So yeah, that's kind of something they reference in the document. It's not super, it's not part of it. And finally, so I mean, again, I'm conscious of the group I'm in today. What does the EU strategy say about privacy, cybersecurity, and identity? Well, they think it's really important. Firstly, they think that the development of virtual worlds will pose challenges to data protection, and these other two issues. They do have some solutions, though. I mentioned this toolbox earlier. I mean, the toolbox will focus on data protection and privacy, cybersecurity, and digital identity. They also think that one of the main goals of this stakeholder forum, which is one of the key actions, will be to manage identities across different platforms. That's kind of one of the key goals, to create that system of interoperability. And finally, they also reference in the document the European Digital Identity Scheme. This is not something novel, but it's something that they're keen for the strategy to sort of lean on. For those that aren't aware, the European Digital ID it'll be in place from 2026. It's an EU-wide digital wallet that you can download as an app on your phone or any other digital device, and it will contain all the information you need to set up a business, to apply for university, to have a driver's license, to verify your age in the supermarket, whether that be in Romania, Portugal, Estonia, Ireland. That is quite an ambitious initiative, and it could provide an interesting platform for some of these virtual worlds applications. Okay, so that was what the European Commission's initial thoughts were on this topic. I now want to move on to the European Parliament, and I'm going to give a bit of context to this. So the European Parliament can't actually propose legislation on its own. Only the European Commission can do that. All the European Parliament can do if it's interested in a topic is write a report about it and then call on the Commission to either propose legislation or amend existing regulation. And despite not being able to propose legislation, it creates a significant amount of political pressure if they speak loudly and if they advocate on certain topics. This title at the moment reads a little bit like The Empire Strikes Back, but actually the European Parliament are overall quite supportive of the EU's initiative, and at the moment there's not a lot of controversial policy going on, so it's kind of unsurprising in one way. But they also raise some interesting issues which we can talk about now. So there are two different committees that wrote reports. Again, both actually voted on today about this topic. The first one is the Internal Market and Consumer Protection Committee, also known as IMCO. Their report was titled Opportunities, Risks, and Policy Implications for the Single Market. What did they talk about? Well, it was led by somebody called Pablo Anchevira. He's a Spanish MEP from the centre-right party, the European People's Party. And Pablo really focused on, again, a kind of nebulous concept, the European way. You'll also be familiar with the concept of the European values. It's not always clear what this meant. In the draft report, there were some quotes in the draft report, saying that we should move away from the development of the US companies. This is kind of it was a bit more tame in the end, but it was very sort of Euro first to begin with. But it's really about the single market. So the report focused on things like interoperability, the need for a level playing field, and really the principle of interoperability should be central to that. Connectivity infrastructure. So he also mentioned the massive amount of data that we expect some of these products and services to use, and flagged that there are concerns that the EU will be ready for that. For those that aren't familiar, this kind of line went down very badly with some of the big digital services in the EU. There's a very big debate going on between big telcos, so big telecommunications companies, and big digital services. And finally, accessibility. So I think this was one of the sort of nice things to see in the report was they're really stressing that there's no point having all of these great, cool products if they can only be accessed by a very small section of society. And although it's not always clear what we mean by the European way, I think that's certainly what Pablo meant when he wrote this report. Again, let's tie it to this group. What are we talking about regarding privacy, cybersecurity, and identity? The report signifies really significant risks for all of these different categories. It kind of ends up advocating for a anonymity light. So the report says, nobody should be able to be completely anonymous in virtual worlds. Again, it's very theoretical, right? Because what are we talking about? Are we talking about people using a headset to explore a digital twin? Well, then, of course, anonymity is not a problem. But if you're talking about a platform where people want to express themselves, it's a kind of different conversation. But just as a principle, I think this was the one pushed. Interestingly, Pablo, the co-authors, and all of the MPs who voted on it, they all kind of agreed that the GDPR is looking a bit shaky in the context of virtual worlds and the development of the metaverse. And that's something that's an ongoing discussion here at the EU. What is the committee actually asking the EU to do? Well, firstly, to assess the infrastructure, the connectivity infrastructure that I spoke about before, to publish regular fitness checks about whether existing regulations such as GDPR can actually deal with these new applications. And finally, thirdly, to report annually on how these virtual worlds are developing and emergent policy risks. And finally, where necessary, and they're keen to stress that this is not yet necessary, put forward legislative proposals. Okay, that's everything from the Internal Markets Committee. I want to move on now to the Legal Affairs Committee. I'm just going to quickly stop in case anyone had any questions so far. I realize I'm kind of flying through. Okay, if not, then I will continue on. So the Legal Affairs Committee then took hold of this topic, and it ends up kind of being a race between the two for relevance. They did finish second, but I think the nature of their report has a bit more import to it, and we'll see why in a moment. They focus on civil, company, commercial, and intellectual property law issues, but they actually expanded their remit in the process. This was led by two former lawyers. We have Axel Voss and Ivan de Blanco. Both of these individuals are very, very influential on the AI Act and in the bubble here. So everyone was quite interested to see what they made of this topic. One of the most interesting quotes in their report was that regulatory issues are actually already apparent. This isn't an emerging topic. This is these applications that are happening now and laws that haven't adapted yet. What does the report say? Well, they flag sort of three categories of issues. One is concerning international law, and they say traditional territorial principles, they're not going to be able to work in virtual spaces, in global virtual spaces. They talk about civil law issues. One of the interesting themes in their report was about users' expectations. So they're not necessarily saying that we need property rights to apply to virtual spaces, but they are saying that that's kind of what the dream that companies are selling to users. And it's their obligation to make it quite clear that no, that's not, they're not protected by property rights. They're just obtaining a license, and things should be phrased to not mismanage their expectations. They also think there's some wording around customers and users and consumers that needs to change as well, owing to these economized spaces. And finally, IP law. They think that IP laws are kind of the most principally under threat. They make reference to NFTs and unsurprisingly, AI generative AI. They kind of put their neck out on generative AI. Actually, I should have included one of the quotes, but they're saying that's something that immediately needs to be addressed. And Axel Voss worked on the AI Act, so just for context, that is not an issue that's being solved in the AI Act. Okay, so what does it say about privacy, cybersecurity, and identity? Well, their report again, they refer to significant ethical and legal concerns, referencing specifically VR sensor data, but in the report they talk about all kinds of different violations, potential violations of privacy. They actually disagree with the other committee. They think that there is a line in the GDPR that could cope with some of these issues, but it's something that definitely needs to be clarified. One of the most interesting parts as well in this committee report was they make reference to the idea of giving avatars a distinct legal status. I think on face value, it brings about a bit of skepticism. What the authors are trying to get to in this report are things like likeness rights. So, can everybody use Tom Cruise's avatar? And what if they're creating sort of libel costs for Tom Cruise's avatar? It's also things like if an avatar dies, who gets to own the assets? There are some kind of semi-interesting issues here, and yeah, it's interesting to see that this is something they honed in on. What is the committee asking the EU to do? Well, it's asking, similar to the other committee, it's asking the EU to examine regulatory gaps, develop guidelines. If there are no gaps, there should be explanations as to how these laws do apply. Secondly, to implement, this is kind of a very specific one. They had an issue with NFTs and trademarks, and they want the EU to clarify this topic too. Those are both of the reports. One thing I'm just going to flag before I give a bit of a view to what's ahead is very much unlike other jurisdictions in the world. If you're looking at the US, there are kind of maybe 1 in 10 bills that are proposed go anywhere. If you're looking at the UK, sorry, Chad, but we'll have 6 prime ministers maybe pass before a bill like the online safety bill goes through. In the EU, it's very different. Once the regulatory machine gets moving, you can slow it down, you can try and speed it up, but it really doesn't stop. So I just want that to be kind of the key message here. And in the last year, the machine really got moving. And let's see what's now coming up. Well, actually, yeah. First, the other huge bit of context is the European elections. In June, we're going to have EU-wide elections. It's not just, I think over half of the democratic world will be taking part in elections next year, but that includes the EU. We'll have the elections in June. This is kind of significant because it then leads on to entirely new cohorts of MEPs and also people in the Commission. and also 7 of the member states in the EU are also having elections. So it's an incredibly busy year. That means that in the immediate term, we won't see a lot of new proposals happening, not until September. But there are some interesting policy happening in the meantime anyway. One that was also announced last week, the Commission's opened up a brand new call. It wants to investigate competition in virtual worlds and generative AI. Deadline to submit is 11th of March for anyone here who would like to. Competition policy is something that's not really been addressed in either of those committee reports or in the strategy. So it's very interesting that they've just popped open this, massive policy area. In the immediate term, there are all these actions that the Commission promised they would do by September. So launching the expert group, we're expecting that toolbox to be published. We've already seen over the last 3 months, tons and tons of new funding streams being opened up. And finally, they also mentioned in the report this, they want to promote this virtual worlds regulatory sandbox. And then in the long term, more initiatives. Both committees called on the Commission to do more in this space, so that is probably going to translate to more initiatives. And again, these kind of all are the first stepping stones to regulation. We'll know more in September, because in September the EU will announce its new agenda for the next 5 years, and then after that's agreed, the Commission will then decide what it wants to do for 2025 specifically. I've just seen something in the chat. So I don't have Daria. Would you mind just opening up the mute so I can speak to you about this? You mentioned a Horizon initiative. So for those that don't know, Horizon's one of the big funding streams for the EU, and you're asking who's coordinating this initiative. Do you mean sort of from the Commission or for that funding stream specifically?
There was a call for applications, and I'm not sure if it was ever published who's spearheading this, but they were supposed to take quite an aggressive stance. It was a 3-year-long project in order to also map out a European-centric, human-centered approach. And it would be very curious to know what consortium sort of is taking the lead on this and how they're integrating into the EU policy contributions. I wonder, if you've heard anything through the grapevine or how. Just thought to put that out there in case anybody knows.
I don't know about that initiative specifically. I do know that there's been a lot of rewards for similar initiatives. So I haven't seen that one in particular. I do know who may know. I'll put her name in the chat, and if you get in touch with me afterwards, I might be able to connect you. Going back to the slide, I think this is actually my last bullet. There will be some new initiatives on this topic. I think the specific subtopics are likely to be the single market, competitiveness, especially in the context of the elections, the well-being of vulnerable users, and the other sort of common thread through some of these initiatives is intellectual property. So those are the predictions for 2020, 2024 and beyond. And I think that's everything from me. So I think I stuck to time, but please let me know if there's any other questions.
Well done, Patrick. That was really good. And while people are formulating their questions for you, please put your hand up to ask Patrick some questions, because we've only got him for another 10 or 15 minutes. Can I just take a kind of chair's privilege and ask you a little bit more about the regulatory sandbox and the opportunity for policy prototyping in this area? You sort of said, of course, with the elections coming up, nothing's happening till September. Is that an opportunity for people to start to kind of put forward thoughts for the next commission and to start to kind of drive an agenda around policy in Europe? I also wanted to ask you if you also just could throw some numbers around in terms of any money commitments that you might know of to support European industry and economic development in the area of the metaverse or Web 4.0, as they call it. And come on, guys, let's also ask Patrick some questions.
Yeah, so going in reverse order, on the funding, I don't know if I'll be able to I have to come back to you on numbers. It's a little bit difficult as well, because some of these initial it's not like they're opening up a metaverse bank. What's actually happening is they're diverting funding from Horizon Europe, from Creative Europe, from existing funds. There's one announced this week on that was like 50 million. They're sort of doing it like this. To your first point on the regulatory sandboxes, so yes, this is a time to try and influence the next 5 years of the Commission's thinking. It's not like a super easy thing to do. What will likely happen in the regulatory sandboxes, what we saw happen in the AI sandboxes, is one of the member countries, in that case Spain, who was the president of the EU at the time. It's like a rotating presidency. They took the initiative to set up a regulatory sandbox, and then they were kind of the first ones. At the moment, the Belgians are the president of the EU, and they're very interested in this topic. My bet would be, if you want to sort of or understand more about the sandboxes or try and influence what happens after the elections, they will be running a pilot on sandboxes, is my guess, before the end of summer. Gavin, fantastic question. Yeah, this is kind of the biggest.
Gavin, can you come on and just ask the question for the benefit of the audience? That would be really good.
Of course, Chad. Very happy to. Thank you very much, Patrick. That's a great presentation. I guess I have an interest in the EU's Digital Services Act and some of the articles in there could potentially have an impact on metaverse platforms going forward. And the whole notion of how we research and find out, what's happening in those platforms and what effect those platforms are having on population and citizens all over the EU. Do you agree with that? Do you think DSA is another one which is going to have a big impact on the platforms going forward?
Yes, during discussions on this topic, there are actually kind of 4 regulations that are constantly quoted. The AI Act, the GDPR, the DSA, and the DMA. And I think especially those last 2, we're expecting those to have a pretty significant impact. So we're hoping it's not kind of a detrimental impact. We're hoping there's not unintended consequences of these 2. Just for everyone else's benefit, the DMA is kind of a big competition piece of regulation and trying to create better interoperability between digital services in the EU. So, for example, as of I think next year, the Apple iPhones will have to open up to new app stores. So you might be able to download a Google App Store on your phone. This is the kind of initiative. The DSA, the one that Gavin is referring to, is like a content moderation bill. So I think in Ireland there's some piece of online safety regulation, and you see it also in the UK. And so to your question, will it have an impact? Yes, it will definitely have an impact. Most of the platforms we imagine now, when some people call metaverses, things like Roblox or Minecraft, or these are fully regulated under the DSA, and if there's any, there'll be poor behavior, there'll be appeals, there'll be fines if the companies don't do anything about it. 100% they will apply. One of the key challenges in this space is to try and work out, okay, what might escape that. So, what are the new kinds of harms? Let's say things like harassment in virtual spaces that might not be captured by the DSA. But the DSA is very much imagining like items of content, and a lot of the transparency reporting is also referring to items of content. We imagine in virtual spaces it will be much more about behavior. So there might be some sort of new kinds of harms that aren't really imagined by something like the DSA. And thank you for sharing those 2 links, Kat.
Excellent. Gavin, do you have any further thoughts, or should we try and coax more questions out of people?
I guess from the perspective of privacy, cybersecurity, identity, I think there's an Article 40 inside DSA which mandates the platform owners to give access to researchers. And I'm intrigued by the prospect of that opening up the box and allowing people, to look very closely at the behavior and how those platforms change people's behavior over time. I think that will be a massive boom to the study and characterization of online harms in whatever shape or form. And I think that's a really interesting prospect going forward, certainly for a group like this, and for a lot of researchers out there.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Thank you, Gavin. Any more questions, or is it going to be just down to me to ask a question, which I hope not?
Well, this is Kim Wales. I'd like to ask a question,
Excellent, Kim.
a basic
Thank
question,
you.
but a real question. You know, we're talking all about the EU here, but how does the United States and Asia, as an example, how can we participate in any real manner so that we do talk about interoperability, that there's true interoperability across borders and not just within the EU member states?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and it brings me back to the citizens panel I attended, and you know, all of the devices that were on show, all of the software that we were using was, you know, strictly European software, and I couldn't help but think, okay, well, these are not the products that European citizens are going to have in their hands. So I think it's a bit of an issue in terms of how you can cooperate. I mean, the Commission is kind of generally open to things like consultations. I mean, anybody in the world can respond to these and try and give their voice. One of the positive things from the strategy was the desire to set up a sort of multi-stakeholder forum, a technical multi-stakeholder forum, which we're hoping is going to be open to non-EU players too. And it's also up to us, you know, here in the EU to make sure that the EU officials come to groups like this and come to, you know, ITU working groups and also engage externally. It's sort of two-way street.
Yeah, I'll just push back just a little bit on, even though those are great suggestions, but like I certainly know I was one of the people that participated with the Jobs Act here in the United States. And then clearly I supported some information around the European Union's first green paper on, you know, securities-based crowdfunding. And the reality is that these bodies of work never came together, and they still don't come together, even though clearly there's securities-based crowdfunding, peer-to-peer lending, and everything else taking place. Everyone is doing something very different. So just we need to figure out a way, maybe through this group, how do we bridge the gap, because there is a gaping hole, really.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting problem. I completely agree.
Yeah, thank you, Kim. And it does kind of raise a question about what's our role as the PCI working group in consultations. Not one for today, but maybe we should be thinking about that between meetings. Do we want to write a point of view and submit that as how we think things should be? I saw that Chris had a question. Chris, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. So earlier on in your presentation, you mentioned that there is an EU strategy towards supporting businesses being involved in standards development. So this isn't really a PCI sort of specific question. I just wondered if you could give a bit more detail on like what that looks like and how that's functioning.
We don't know anything about that yet. That's one of the actions that we haven't seen publicly, and I don't have a lot of intel on that. One thing that I do know that I'm trying to just share with you, which is why I stopped sharing my screen. The Commission also set up this group. Again, you'll notice there's only EU companies, I'm afraid. But it's a coalition of companies, and one of their goals is to support the development of standards. So yeah, that's all I can provide on that point, sadly.
I've been trying to track them down to get speakers from them, but they don't seem to be kind of stood up completely yet. Daria, you also were making a point. Do you want to expand on that?
Yes, I mean, coming from just the way that the EU is positioning all of the investment of resources, it's very much about trying to support European technology. So they would like to rely on their own technological stack. But I think the reality of the way that the technology is developing is that it will have to be a worldwide initiative and phenomenon. So in a way, there's this obvious tension that is being played out. And in a way, I think the Metaverse Standards Forum is this unique opportunity to get a crossover between what the EU is doing. And Chad, you had always said that the EU guidelines sort of drive the global developments, and whatever the EU puts into place to some degree has to be adopted by US and China, or at least responded to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Partly, Daria, because as Patrick said, the legislative train, once it leaves the European station, just relentlessly sets out law and standards. And it does it, and they have a desire to be first. They want to put their flag on the top of every regulatory mountain. Anyway, sorry I interrupted, Daria.
No, I just wanted to bring that kind of into focus and to see if perhaps maybe not right this minute, but if we could find answers for how to bridge this kind of ideological tug of war between, you know, this only has to happen in the EU bubble, which is probably also why you're having a hard time accessing the VR and augmented reality coalition, perhaps maybe just a suspicion, and also the kind of necessary crossover international coordination that is necessary for this to really take off. I just wanted to put that out there, you know, and kind of name the obvious.
I think a couple of us have identified, you know, this problem, and there needs to be more sort of communication with the outside world. I can tell you what hasn't worked. I mean, there's been so many public partnerships between the likes of, you know, whether that be Meta and BMW or Nvidia and Siemens, and these efforts to show sort of the benefits to the EU business ecosystem haven't really proved successful. So I do think it has to be something elevated to the political or policy level.
While we wait, we're in our final minutes. Of course, we can carry on, Patrick. But just I think what you, Daria, raised, and maybe what Kim was raising, comes back to something you said earlier, which is, what is the European way and European values which create the gap which needs to be bridged and the dialogue that needs to happen? Do you have a sense of how one could articulate that? You touched on it a little, but could we just draw that out a little bit more?
Yeah, I think it's just a preference for principles like privacy and safety. You'll often hear people approach an EU official and talk about all of the opportunity cost or that the EU suffers from its regulation, and officials will just turn around and say, well, it's okay because we have the strongest privacy standards in the world, and that's kind of what they mean by EU values. I think it's also kind of our duty here maybe to respond to that and say, you know, we see a wave of exciting innovation happening, and we, as part of EU values, we should interpret that as not wanting to miss out on this, because if we believe this will have a, you know, positive impact on including for the safety of EU citizens, then that's kind of another way of reframing it. But yeah, I would just say sort of this prioritization of the safety and privacy of citizens.
Thank you, Patrick. Any more? I mean, technically, we're over, but if we have some kind of stonking questions for Patrick, then I'm sure he'll stay. If not, we can thank him for a really great session. Any more?
Yeah, sorry, I just see Daria in the chat. I'll just leave my email in. Yes, of course. Please feel free to reach out after this. That would be fantastic. And just while I have the microphone, thank you again for having me, and cheers especially to Chad and Kat.